So let's talk through the Drukhari units, what's strong and what is less so. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. So the Drukhari Codex has been out for a few weeks now. In general it's looking very strong and very well balanced, though even within this codex I think there are some units that stand out just a bit more than others. With that in mind, I've ranked the units into my estimate of the strongest units in the codex, ranked into 4 different tiers, starting with the weakest and moving forward to the strongest. I will say that I think I'm making this tier list quite early in the day. There haven't been all that many events yet where Drukhari have been able to be played, so if there are any placings where you think that I might have ranked them too high or too low, please let me know down in the comments. In any case, let's jump straight into it, talk through each and every unit in the Drukhari Codex and why I think that they're as strong as they are. So first up, down in the bottom tier, these are the 2 units that I'm the least fan of in the Drukhari Codex. Unfortunately, after having compared Lilith Hesperax to the other succubi that you can run, I think that she's just unfortunately vastly inferior. Almost any standard succubus with a warlord trait and relic will easily outfight her, despite costing around about 30 points less. Quite sad for the newest addition to the Drukhari range, but really in a codex absolutely filled to the brim with lethal characters, she's about the last one that I'd personally pick. She's definitely not going to be appearing in many competitive lists anytime soon, and is certainly much more of a fun and fluffy choice at the moment. The other unit that I'm afraid I'm just not a fan of is the Beastmaster. I might be being a little bit harsh ranking them below the beasts, but I basically see them as a tax unit to get the beasts in the army if you want them. As a 40-point cheap support character, they can have their uses, maybe doing a little bit of screening work, and they do provide some small damage buffs to the beast units themselves and allow one unit to advance and charge. But I must admit, I think that the codex would be stronger if the Beastmaster just didn't exist and the beasts were able to be taken without him. I guess you could argue that you have to consider them as just one whole beasts plus Beastmaster, and in that case I would rank them a little bit higher along with the rest of the beasts. So moving on to tier 3 now, units that I think are going to be fairly rare to see in competitive lists, but I still think are all absolutely usable in more casual games. Here I've chosen to rank the Talos Pain Engine, the Kronos Parasite Engine, the Court of the Archon, and the other beast units. First off, I think that the Talos really has been hit quite hard, it's just not at the same sort of level as durability as compared with when it could get a 4+ invul save. It can still do some fairly reasonable range and melee damage output, and it is perhaps one of the better beneficiaries of buffs like the Homunculus, but I'm just not sure they're efficient enough to be taken en masse. I guess we'll see. I'll certainly be interested if we do see some top players managing to make them work at tournaments. Next up, I've ranked the Kronos Parasite Engine here. For the points, this thing certainly is cheap and tough, and I guess it could give you one more annoying threat that your opponent has to deal with, but I'm just not sure that it really does enough to harm the opponent's army for the points invested. I guess in theory its buffs could be useful. It can give you a little bit of extra combat punch, potentially heal other Drukhari from the dead, so it's partway between being a synergy piece and a damage dealer, but I'm just not sure how well it meshes with the rest of the Drukhari army, which quite a lot of them might just want to just zoom straight forward on raiders and take the fight straight to the enemy. I guess it is fairly cheap and tough for the points, which is a good thing in 9th, but until I've seen it work I remain to be convinced. The Court of the Archon is certainly an interesting unit. They've changed radically in the new codex, being a single unit, and they do provide a few niche benefits to the Archon, such as some buffs to poison weapons, and perhaps more importantly shielding the Archon from harm at range when they're nearby. Perhaps could be handy for a few bodyguards, but I just think that they struggle to compete with the other units that compile into raiders, particularly witches, which I'd much rather run instead most of the time if you did want something that's a fighty close range unit jumping out of transports. Finally, we have the 3 beast units, Razorwing Flocks, Chimerae and Clawed Fiends, all of which saw some decent improvements in the new codex as well, and I'll be honest, for their raw stats alone I do quite like them. Razorwings and really resilient chaff units with 4 wounds per base, even if they are all toughness 2, and the Chimerae and Clawed Fiends both have fairly decent close combat profiles for the cheap points. However, because you have to buy the Beastmaster as a tax for them, and they have fairly low leadership so you would want to keep him nearby, again I feel that these are going to struggle to outcompete units like Witches and Incubi, who also do the anti-infantry melee role very well, and perhaps have more synergies within the codex, like stratagems and cults that you can use on them. As these things are beasts, they don't have any additional bonuses, you just get what you pay for the points. Next up we come on to tier 2. These are the units that I think will be seen in competitive lists. I think they're all fairly solid units that work well, but maybe just don't seem quite as much of an auto-include to me as the ones in tier 1. Here I've ranked the Homunculus, Urian Rakaf, Venoms, the Razor Wing Jetfighter and Void Raven, Grotesques, and the Ravager. Out of all of these, the one that I was most tempted to put up in Tier 1 would be the Homunculus. I think as an HQ choice he is still solid. Obviously, if you're going down a Coven's route, then it's kind of natural that you're going to want one or more of these. He makes units tougher, and he heals some of the bigger flesh monstrosities about, but just on his base stats alone, I'm just not quite as convinced that he is absolutely outstanding compared with the Archon and Succubus. Perhaps the single most powerful use for him is to run him in the Coven of the Dark Creed, which has an option to allow him to remove OBSEC from nearby enemy units. That's really quite powerful in combination with cheap and fast OBSEC Drukhari. Could certainly be the difference between flipping some primary objectives for a turn or two. He'll most certainly be taken in real space raider detachments anyway, so maybe I should have put him in Tier 1 after all. Next up we have Urian Rakarth, who does seem like a fairly reasonable upgrade on the Homunculus if you are running Prophets of Flesh. He seems like a fairly decent upgrade if you are running that Coven. He adds 1 to the strength of nearby units and is exceptionally harder to kill, even more than standard Homunculi. Probably my biggest gripe with him is that he's locked to that one Coven, and he also doesn't get free choice of relics or warlord traits. Still though, for the points for an HQ, then it's not too bad. Next up, I've chosen to rank the Venom here below the Raider. I did a bit of a comparison video on the channel weighing up all the pros and cons of Venoms and Raiders, and I must admit I think it's Raiders that are going to be the new hotness this edition. Raiders are generally going to be tougher, particularly in close combat. They have more transport capacity and are arguably more dangerous as well, with that one really powerful Dark Lance shot as opposed to a bunch of Splinterfire. I still certainly wouldn't say Venoms are bad, and can even be preferable perhaps if you are running Cabal of the Poisoned Tongue. But the extra toughness and wounds of the Raider I think are really the biggest deal. I think they're usually going to be worth more than the -1 to hit at range. Next we come to the Drukhari Flyers, and here we have the Razor Wing Jetfighter and Void Raven Bomber. I'd say both of these are pretty interesting. They're not truly exceptional. They're both at least reasonably fragile, good movement, and have fairly good shooting that they're going to be able to deploy exactly where they want to by being able to swoop over and see all the enemy units that are cowering out of line of sight. Both of them can do that very well. The biggest difference is that Void Mine that the Void Raven Bomber gets, giving a potentially devastating mortal wound area effect, where units within 6 inches of a point that it flew over get up to d6 mortal wound on the roll of a 4+. It could significantly punish an army that's clustered up close together. In general, I think they're both fairly worth it for the points, good but perhaps not exceptional, and of the two I'm preferring the look of the Void Raven Bomber right now, just because of the sheer fear factor that Void Mine could put in your opponent's deployment. Next we come to Grotesques, another unit that might have taken a bit of a hit in the latest Codex, losing access to that nice innate 4+ invul save that they used to have. Their roles perhaps changed a bit, where they can't just be a durable brick of a unit anymore, they do actually need to do some damage, as they're not going to soak up as much firepower as they used to. But fortunately both their liquefied guns and grotesque cleavers are both quite interesting. Their liquefied guns can be overcharged safely with dark technomancers at the moment, and the cleavers gaining 2 damage is quite a big deal as well. Again, at the moment I'd peg them as good but not absolutely standout, and certainly a unit that I'll be watching to see what people make of. Finally, last but not least, we come to the Ravager, a solid and reliable gun platform that I perhaps think is going to get taken more for its Dark Lances than it is for its Disintegrators these days. Now those Dark Lances are D3+3 damage. At 140 points it seems pretty fairly costed to me. You're basically paying sensible numbers for the damage output that you get. Not a terrible option for holding down the backfield and taking a few pot shots while the rest of the army surges forward. Again, like most of this list, I don't think that there's much wrong with it, but I think it's just perhaps not one of the star units of the Codex, particularly as it lost the core keyword and access to those easy rerolls. So that leaves us with quite a big chunk of the Codex that I think is absolutely top tier, and these are the units that I think that people are most frequently going to be building around in tournaments. We'll go through them one by one individually, but to do a brief summary, we have the Archon, Succubus, Drazar, Cabalite Warriors, Witches, Racks, Incubi, Mandrakes, Helions, Reaver Jetbikes, and Scourges. They're frankly all powerful or very useful in their own right, and I strongly expect they'll see good play. Let's start out with the baddest Dark Elf in the city then, and we have the Archon. He's an amazingly good HQ, cheap at 65 points. He grants some nice rerolls of 1 to all Cabalite Warriors nearby, and if he's the head of a real space raid, then he can grant that reroll 1 to any core units for all the Drukhari Codex. The shadow field's pretty random, but just every so often he can tank virtually anything that's thrown at him. He can be a respectable combat with the Jin Blade and the Warlord trait that allows him to reroll all hits and wounds, or potentially even more powerfully, he can make opponents fight last with another Warlord trait. That one is really potent, particularly in combination with charging Drukhari units that are quite fragile and prone to be interrupted against. For any sort of balanced Drukhari list, I think that this guy will be making an appearance. Next up we have the Succubus, which for the points I might put her down as perhaps the strongest unit in the entire book. She's 60 points, and give her a combination of many of the different warlord traits and relics, and she turns into an absolute blender that will go through entire squads at a time. The Triptych Whip and Precision Blows is a really easy one, wounds on 2s, and generates a good amount of mortal wounds every time she fights. Razor Flails, Grave Lotus, and Competitive Edge is a really potent combination from the Charadon supplement. I did an entire video on that Succubus, and how she kills on average 10 Space Marine Intercessors in one round of combat. Pretty mental stuff. There's plenty of other viable combos on top of that, such as the Bloodglaive, and furthermore she has the chance to lock enemy units in melee that might not want to get trapped there, provide some nice rerolls to witches, and dance in and out of combat for free with a Master Succubus upgrade. Of course she's not very fragile if you are able to shoot at her back, so she does need to be carefully screened, but get one effective charge off with her and she should be able to be making her points back then and there. Next up we come to Drukhari, who is far more expensive, but is also even stronger in melee and also really tough to boot. He'll hit you with 5 strength 6 AP-3 damage 3 attacks and then fight twice to do it all over again. He gets +1 to wound with all those attacks and gives that same aura to nearby incubi as well, turning them from really solid units into extreme blenders. And then if he does get targeted by enemy attacks, he's got a 2+ save, a 4+ armor, and takes -1 damage from enemy weapons. As Eldar characters go, he's one of the toughest. On top of that, he gets the normal incubi rule to have the chance for making enemies fight last, and if you do take him as warlord, his warlord trait will grant you 4 rerolls to hit and to wound. It doesn't really matter whether he's thrown into hordes of infantry or into super heavy vehicles, he's going to make a massive dent in them. Other factions will certainly wish that they had a melee HQ quite this competent. Next up we come to the 3 flavours of Drukhari troops. I think they've done well with these to balance them, and they all serve their own role very well. Cavalite Warriors are your cheap and shooty unit, 8 points for a little bit of splinter shooting, kind of meant for cruising around in transports and being ready to secure objectives either in the backfield or the midfield. Taking a blaster in the unit is quite an efficient use of rerolls, say for Cabal of the Black Heart where you get to reroll 1 dice. Or you can go all in on the Splinter Fire strategy and maybe take the Cabal of the Poisoned Tongue and put a unit in a raider with Splinter Racks for 20 shots at 24 inches that wound everything that isn't a vehicle on 3s. That's going to stack some saves on some infantry and no mistake. I think their armor save increase to a 4+ has been a really nice boost for them. It means that they're not quite as incidental to remove when they get out and stand on objectives. And you do have the potential for a bit of souped up damage output by making them a squad of Trueborn and have them cruise around with blasters and a dark lance. I have a feeling that they're not going to be the most taken troops choice. I would say that that's likely going to be witches, but having a few extra ranged units certainly doesn't hurt at all. Talking of witches, they're basically your go-to melee choice for transports. They're 10 points per model and 3 attacks base, and they throw absolutely buckets of fairly decent melee attacks, usually at strength 4 with their combat drugs, or you can even take the cult that makes them strength 4 innately and get them even more attacks. Just 100 points of 10 witches piling out of a raider will be throwing down a crazy 41 attacks at strength 4 AP-1, and that can get even better if you have some special weapons, character buffs, stratagems, or useful cults. Again, they can prevent fallback results as well, and Hectrix Blood Brides can hit on 2s, making them even more deadly. I think that quite a lot of Drukhari lists at the moment are going to revolve around big blocks of witches jumping out of raiders, murdering the enemy, and then stealing the objectives with their OBSEC. Finally, speaking of objectives, that's where the racks come in. 8 points per model means that they're one of the best choices for holding down backfield objectives, and just making it painful for your opponent to have to chew through them because they're really quite tough for the points. Each rack is toughness 4 with a 5+ feel no pain save, and also their invul save that they get from power from pain. They can get even more annoying to remove if you take them as prophets of flesh, where they can't be wounded quite as easily, and they can actually be fairly respectable damage dealers in their own right if you take them as Dark Technomancers racks and give them a couple of liquefier guns between the squad. They can currently do some pretty effective drive-bys out of raiders, and because they get +1 to wound and +1 damage on those liquefiers, they're pretty effective against almost any target that you point them at. Again, probably not going to be spammed quite as much as witches, but I think we'll regularly see a few small units of them, mainly aimed for holding down backfield objectives and being a nuisance throwaway unit for grunt work. Where the witches are fairly focused on anti-infantry melee, we now have the Incubi, another fairly glasshammer close combat unit that is just thoroughly murderous to everything in melee. The Claves are strength 5, AP -3 and damage 2, which is good news for killing virtually anything that you put them against, and they've got a good number of attacks, all hitting on 2s. Having Drazar or an Archon or both nearby will only make them stronger. They still have that chance to make the enemy fight last by rolling off against their leadership, and I think it's quite common that we'll see multiple small units of these, also in transports, jumping out to chop up the enemy. Honestly, if there was a way of making these guys troops or something, I suspect we might see entire armies of them in transports, and it's possibly for the best that they're restricted to the elite slot. I kind of feel like these fulfill the same role as Sisters Repentia for the Dark Eldar. They're just an incredibly efficient melee choice. Next up we come to the Mandrakes, perhaps a really handy utility unit just to have one unit of in the army. For me they are a little bit pricey at 15 points per model. You really are paying for the utility that they have, and for that you get the forward deployment, so you could start on midfield objectives and do some screening if it made sense, or if not you could have them as basically a guaranteed way to use the deploy scramblers secondary by using their fade away stratagem and jumping into the enemy deployment zone late game. For the points they are very fragile, their damage output is okay but not stellar, they can put out some mortal wounds with their Bale Blast shooting, but I don't think that this is their primary focus. I certainly don't think that Mandrakes will be spammed at all, but for just a single unit within an army list, I think that would generally make things stronger. Next up we have the very efficient Drukhari fast attack choices, the Hellions, Reavers and Scourges. Hellions are certainly one of the most improved units in the Drukhari decks, 17 points per model, very fast, and actually compared with some other choices, they can be comparatively tough now. I think I'll be most tempted by the combat drug that makes them toughness 5, which is going to make them significantly harder to shift with small arms. They have some okay range damage with their splinter pods, and then really quite efficient melee with a base strength of 4 and the normal Blade Artist special rule. I think for a Drukhari unit, Hellions are just kind of all-rounders now. Between the lot of their abilities, they're fast, fairly tough, a little bit of range, and a decent amount of melee. Finally though, and perhaps most intimidatingly, they have that eviscerating flyby stratagem where they have the potential to dump out a ton of mortal wounds on one enemy unit that they moved over. Theoretically, this could get into very silly damage territory if you're taking really large amounts of Hellions, but even with a fairly reasonable sized unit of 10, if you move over an enemy infantry unit, that's very likely to be 5 mortal wounds then and there. Lots to like about these guys, and I'm sure they'll be making appearances. Their rivals for the fast attack and the witch cult choices are of course the Reaver jet bikes. These are maybe a bit more of a premium option at 20 points per model, but what they get for their investment is a ridiculous amount of speed. With their base movement and advance, that's 26 inch worth of movement per turn, and if you do hang fire until turn 2, then they can even charge after that. By taking a unit of these guys, you're basically paying for a unit that can get almost anywhere on the table and tie up or maybe even kill an enemy unit that your opponent really can't afford to lose. I think their Heat Lancers are really quite an interesting choice. They're short-ranged, very cheap, but they do have the big D3+3 damage, so even one wound going through is pretty potent. Finally, on top of all that, they can also use Eviscerating Flyby and would have a far better choice of targets to use it on compared with Hellions, so at least that's one incentive to use a big unit of maybe 12 Reavers. Finally, for the fast attack, we have the quick and cheap point and delete unit that are the Drukhari Scourges. The way that everyone seems to be interested in fielding them these days is 100 points for a Scourge squad with 4 blasters, maybe placed on the board if there's really good line of sight blocking terrain, but perhaps more likely jumps down from deep strike, or ready to put 4 quality anti-tank shots into an enemy unit that really doesn't want to be taking them. Unless you're positioning well, then they are likely to die the following turn. They're very much one-hit wonders unless you can really overload the opponent with loads of targets, but you could potentially try and make their damage output even better by jumping into the aura of a Real Space Raid Archon and getting a few reroll 1s into the bargain. Pretty cheap and a good way to put some concentrated ranged firepower on one enemy unit. Finally, last but by no means least, we have the ubiquitous Drukhari Raider. 85 points with a Dark Lance, recently upgone to damage D3+3, and this can give you some nice dispersed anti-tank fire within the Drukhari army, so you don't have to focus too heavily on dedicated units. The transports are kind of integral to the function of the infantry. Units like Incubi, Cabalite Warriors, Witches, and the characters really want to be in transports, and as I said, I think the Raider just has it over the Venom at the moment. The wounds and toughness just outweigh the -1 to hit and the slight boost of speed for me. I think that some of the upgrades for the transports can be quite interesting as well. In particular, Grizzly Trophies can be an interesting combo with the Dark Creed Homunculus Covens. that can actually stack some genuinely effective leadership debuffing with -3 to leadership and -1 to combat attrition. Splinter Axe, as I mentioned earlier, can also be another fun one. It certainly makes a big Auspex unit of Cabalite warriors a lot more attractive, so it can just hover on an objective at a safe distance, laying down some accurate splinter fire, always rapid firing. Quite nice to see perhaps one of the most iconic units of the Drukhari doing very well. So anyway, that brings us to the end of the Drukhari tier ranking. I do genuinely think that this codex is well written and interesting. There are a lot more units that I've placed in the top tier than virtually any other tier ranking that I've made. As always, I look forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas. Are there any units that I've ranked too high, or anything that I've ranked too low that you think might be top tier? Look forward to reading the debates down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly be hoping to get some more tier rankings and Drukhari videos out in the future. Finally, if you are enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention the thing that keeps them coming, which is the Auspex Tactics Patreon page. All the videos, particularly quite in-depth ones like this, do take a fair amount of time to make, so if you are enjoying regularly, then any support is massively appreciated to help keep them coming. Channel patrons do get access to a fair few perks and advantages, such as seeing certain new videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next, and automatic entry to the monthly prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.